To prepare for the launch of The Last of Us Season 2, I was watching Season 1 again, when this scene came up. It's the scene where Ellie and Joel are walking through the countryside when she notices something strange in the grass. What she sees is quiet, unmarked, and overgrown. This is where Joel explains, these were people who were told they'd be relocated for safety, but never were. Instead, they were put here. This is how the world ends. In silence. Not with explosions, not in chaos, just silence. Empty roads, collapsed cities, and a few survivors scouring the ruins. This scene is so chilling because it reminds us that governments protect systems, not people. If you are not useful, or worse, in the way, this is where you will end up. In the light of this scene, we could ask ourselves, if everything collapses tomorrow, and this is what the world after looks like, would you want to survive? What does the morality of survival look like, and is the answer maybe hidden in plain sight in the title of the show itself? The question whether you wanted to survive the apocalypse or not lately doesn't feel hypothetical anymore. Global tensions are rising, superpowers are threatening each other with nuclear weapons on public platforms, the doomsday clock is edging closer to midnight, climate instability is no longer decades away, it's here, now. Some people answer that question of survival with a hell yeah, and are already planning for it. Building bunkers, buying islands, airlifting hydroponic farms into the middle of nowhere. Mark Zuckerberg reportedly bought a $270 million self-sustaining compound in Hawaii.
Because that is what normal humans do. Very normal. Much human.
It seems like survival is becoming a luxury commodity. Others are answering this question with a hard no thank you. I get it. Who wants to drink rainwater from a rusty tin and fight off cannibals just to make it another week? So, when thinking about the apocalypse and what life might look like in it, first and foremost, it's important to realize survival is not a victory. It's a choice. In The Last of Us, nobody survives by accident. Here we can clearly see that survival is a choice, a brutal one. But just as in our society, not everyone recognizes that it's a choice. Some characters make a deliberate decision to go on and wrestle with it. Others are simply propelled forward by momentum, fear, or instinct without ever asking if it's still worth it. Take Henry, for example. When his brother Sam is infected and turns, he relieves his brother from the coming fate. But almost instantly, the consequences of that act crush him. He can't imagine a life without Sam, and just like that, he decides he doesn't want to go on either. For him, survival was a choice, and he chose to stop. Ellie too has moments where survival shakes her identity. After dealing with David, we see a version of Ellie that is completely dissociated, shattered. She walks away from that encounter alive, but not unbroken. For her, survival in that moment is not triumph, it's trauma. On the other side, we have someone like Kathleen, the leader of the Kansas City resistance. She's so locked into vengeance and control that survival becomes automatic, blinded by a supposed purpose, detached from reflection. And ultimately, it leads her and her group straight into destruction. And then we have people who slowly realize that in fact it's a choice. Bill. In episode 3, the entire backstory of Bill and Henry unfolds. A story of love, safety, and stillness in a world that has none. Bill was a survivalist, a prepper. He builds walls, sets traps, stockpiles food. He survives alone because at first to him that's all there is. But then Frank arrives, and Bill discovers something that changes his entire perspective on survival. He says it plainly, "I was never afraid before you showed up." For Bill, survival suddenly becomes a means, not the end. A way to protect love, to preserve something fragile and good. So survival is a question of why. Only this reason gives legitimacy of raising the question whether or not survival is moral. Specifically, is it moral to survive if surviving means doing immoral things? Taken on its own, this is the classic clash between utilitarianism and deontology, two major schools of moral philosophy. Utilitarianism developed in the late 18th century by thinkers like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, who argued that actions are right if they maximize overall happiness. Deontology, most famously associated with Immanuel Kant, claims that morality comes from duty, that that some actions are right or wrong regardless of their consequences. Do the ends justify the means? Do you sacrifice one to save many? Or do you follow a moral code no matter the cost? Joel doesn't hesitate when it comes to saving Ellie, even if it means destroying the one chance humanity has at a cure. Was he wrong? Was he right? Well, that depends not only on the framework, but on the perspective. Utilitarianism would argue that sacrificing Ellie to save the many is the moral path. Deontology, depending on how you interpret it, might say that using Ellie without her consent is a violation of her dignity and autonomy. But Joel? He doesn't follow either. He chooses Ellie, not because it's moral, but because it's personal. The Last of Us doesn't choose sides. Because in this world, survival is an act of moral improvisation. The show constantly asks, are you surviving as a person or just as a body? And whether you reflect on that or not might determine what you become. But if survival is all about improvisation, if nobody's following a rulebook, does that mean there are no rules at all? No absolutes? Because when the world collapses, laws go with it. Courts, governments, police, gone. And with them the systems we rely on to decide for us what is right or wrong. But morality doesn't disappear, it mutates. Get the pun? Mutates, like the mushroom people? Anyway, in the vacuum of legal authority, people rebuild their own moral structures. Some communities become authoritarian, like Fedra, tight control, rigid hierarchy, order at all costs. Others, like the Fireflies, base their morality on rebellion, freedom, sacrifice, which is a very interesting aspect on its own. The Fireflies define themselves by rebellion. Rebellion against what? They define themselves in opposition to Fedra's authoritarianism. Hence, their identity is shaped by resistance to, not vision of, something. The apocalypse gave them a unifying enemy, but in a vacuum, without something to fight against, would they still have a purpose? Their morality is reactionary, not foundational, a blinding symptom that also exists in our today's world, even before the apocalypse. So much of our moral identity is defined by opposition, by what we reject. But if all the systems collapsed, if there was no enemy left to resist, what values would we build from scratch? So in search for something absolute, we quickly arrive at religion. What's more absolute than the gods? In The Last of Us, we see one version of how this can play out. David's group. Outwardly religious, inwardly terrifying. David quotes scripture while secretly feeding his people human flesh. He claims moral clarity through faith, but uses it to justify abuse and violence. And this is where religion gets tricky, because when law is gone, religion often steps in, not just as comfort, but as command. It offers absolute answers, it gives people something to cling to. Faith, when unquestioned, can become dogma, and dogma doesn't adapt. In a radically changed world, that rigidity can be dangerous. David doesn't just believe he's right, he believes he's righteous. And that righteousness becomes a weapon. Sure, one could argue it's only his human flaw that turns religion into a weapon. It's not an innate element of the concept of religion itself. In real life, that doesn't necessarily have to happen. Oh yeah? Yeah? Interesting. So where do you turn when both law and religion fails you? For Joel and Ellie, the answer is each other. They don't follow a doctrine, they don't quote a book, they build something smaller. A shared moral compass. It's flawed, messy, incomplete, but it's theirs. And in a world without absolutes, maybe that's the most honest kind of morality left. This is where the philosophy of Albert Camus, the French-Algerian philosopher writing in the 1940s at the height of fascism and amid the devastation of World War II, becomes especially relevant. In a world stripped of meaning, Camus argued that we face the absurd, the gap between our desire for clarity and the chaos we live in. But his solution wasn't despair, it was rebellion. Not violent revolution, but the quiet, stubborn act of continuing to live and create meaning even when the universe offers none. In this sense, survival itself becomes a form of defiance. So now we reach the deeper question, the one that lingers after all the rules collapse and morality is left gasping for air. Why survive at all? In a world filled with loss, fear, and unrelenting violence, what's the point of holding on? Some characters in The Last of Us answer this with silence. For them, surviving becomes just a habit, one foot in front of the other, a reflex. But others wrestle with that question, and their answers reveal something bigger about human nature. For Bill, survival becomes an act of love. For Joel, it becomes an act of grief. For Ellie, it shifts from curiosity to vengeance to a quiet, aching form of hope. But the show doesn't romanticize it. Survival often means doing things that can chip away at our humanity. And here's the paradox. The longer you survive, the more you risk becoming the kind of person who wouldn't deserve to live in the world you're trying to rebuild. And that leads us to a painful idea. Sometimes survival is not the noble choice. Sometimes it's the selfish one. Because if you survive at any cost, if you kill, betray, destroy what you once stood for, what exactly are you surviving as? In our real world, this hits harder than ever. As apocalyptic fears rise, people are preparing bunkers, hoarding wealth, building walls, but survival in a luxury bunker without purpose isn't safety, it's just isolation with better plumbing. Because in the end, isn't living the goal of survival? Isn't survival only sensible for the goal of living? This detail is important because living without morality, without meaning, without love, might not be living at all. So like everything we do in life, just as well survival is about the question, what comes next? And for that, it does matter who survives or what survives with you. In The Last of Us, survival leaves visible scars. But the deepest wounds are invisible. Characters carry guilt, trauma, and silence. And sometimes survival isn't the end of the story, it's the start of something harder. Joel is never the same after what he does to save Ellie. His smile comes slower, his silence lasts longer, he's haunted by a choice he can never undo. Ellie too survives David, but loses a part of herself. When she deals with him, she's not just determining his end, she's ending a version of her own. And that's not fiction, that's real. In the aftermath of conflicts, human destruction or disaster, survivors often face something known as survivor's guilt. A profound and lingering shame that they lived when others didn't. Many survivors have spoken about the pain of carrying forward. Some questioned whether their survival was a betrayal. Some took their own lives years later, not because they lacked strength, but because they couldn't live with what it had cost. Veterans, earthquake, tsunami victims, across history we see it again and again. Surviving is not the end of trauma, it's the beginning of a new one. Which brings us full circle. Because if survival destroys your sense of self, your morality, your empathy, what's the point? Survival in itself isn't a state, it's a transition. It's what comes after that gives it meaning. And The Last of Us quietly insists that survival must be tied to something humane, something tender, vulnerable, even fragile, something worth rebuilding for. Because in the end, the morality of survival isn't about what you do to stay alive. It's about who you're becoming while you do it, and whether the world you're surviving into is one you'd want anyone else to inherit. So all along, the answer to the question about the morality of survival was hidden in the title of the show itself. The Last of Us does not only describe the few of us who are left, it points to the fact that we have to keep in mind that survival creates the last version of us, a version of ultimate relevance. It's the last of us, everything that remains in the end, and all questions of morality can only be definitely answered by this last version of us. So what do you think? Comment below whether you would like to survive and why. You know what? Let's do a Mr. Beast and choose someone at random from the comments to receive a free spot in this luxurious bunker. Nah, I'm just kidding. There's no space for you in the bunker. But if you like videos like this one, consider subscribing and liking the video, because if something survives the apocalypse, it will be the rigidity of the YouTube algorithm. And speaking of the power of algorithms, check out this video about what Game of Thrones tells us about who has the power in the future ahead. See you next time.